Age of Empires Definitive Edition. A relic from the past and a trip down the nostalgia lane. However, is it a good one? Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Integer, and today I will be bringing you a short review of the Age of Empires Definitive Edition that came out on the 20th of February and is available exclusively on Microsoft Store for Windows 10. Personally, this game hits home hard. It was released in Europe back in 1998, and I started playing it very shortly afterwards. I can't even tell you where I was able to get the copy from, but the fact of the matter is, this is one of the reasons for my strong passion and love to strategy games. I have spent countless hours playing the campaigns, or at least trying to, as to me personally, being quite young and very inexperienced, not only in strategy but video games in general. The whole concept of gathering resources, building your own base, building units, composing an army and attacking enemy positions was very unfamiliar. Not even to start talking about any somewhat more advanced tactics that could have been employed. But I enjoyed the game thoroughly nonetheless, and everything from its graphical style to soundtrack to animations do initiate a very strong nostalgic feeling, and I quite regularly reminiscent about the good old days when I used to play this game. So when the definitive edition was announced sometime during 2017, it was a no-brainer for me to pick it up right on the release. The game, as mentioned before, was released on the 20th of February and is available exclusively on Microsoft Store on Windows 10 only. Currently, the game is retailing for £15 here in the United Kingdom, or probably regional equivalent, whether you're in the States or mainland Europe or anywhere else in the world. And the main question is, does the game justify its price? So now let me very briefly touch on the definitive edition aspect of this game. Essentially, from what I've seen, from what I've played, I can very firmly say that the game only received a visual and audio transformations. When it comes to the gameplay itself, there has been barely, if any, changes or additions made, which is not necessarily a bad thing. However, given the fact that the game was released in 1997, when the strategy game genre itself, even though it was flourishing, it was still in its heyday, there are several things that make this game, in my opinion, not that multiplayer feasible, which in turn immediately renders game's longevity to any average player very much reduced. Now let me sidestep here for a brief moment, for if you are unfamiliar with the formula that Age of Empires follows, it is a relatively simple one. You use villagers to gather resources and create buildings. There's few different types of buildings. Military buildings are able to produce military units. There are research and technology buildings that will allow you to unlock and research more advanced technologies. There are other buildings that will allow you to simplify and streamline your resource gathering, and so on and so forth. Essentially, there are 4 ages that you as a civilization go through each game, starting with the Stone Age, advancing towards Tool Age, and next one being Bronze Age, and the final age being the Iron Age. Each age, as mentioned before, unlocks better technologies, new buildings, and new units for you to research and use at the best of your disposal. And essentially, it's a race towards getting to the later age quicker, having a technological and a unit advantage over your enemy, and overcoming them in one way or another. Again, like I've said, it's a relatively simplistic formula, but due to that simplicity, it gives freedom of variation for relatively interesting gameplay aspects and strategies that can be employed. The game offers you to choose from any of its 16 available civilizations, which are divided into 4 subcategories, those being Greek-inspired, Egyptians and surrounding areas, Sumerian/Mesopotamian, as well as the Oriental. Those share major traits across what units and technologies are available. However, they are all unique in what specific technologies and units you can research or create, thus giving a nice little flexibility and the unpredictability in how you're going to approach the game based on what civilization you choose. the game's single-player campaigns are actually based on real historic events, thus creating that certain level of authenticity, as well as providing somewhat interesting and perhaps before unknown facts from our history. And to sum it up, overall, even if the original game was not a pathfinder in what game mechanics it provided to the players, I think it definitely acted as a very big inspiration point for the future strategy games to come. And as such, its credibility and accountability for what the strategy games genre is today should not be discounted in the slightest. Now, let me touch a little bit more on the visual and audio overhauls of the game. Essentially, this being still a relatively old game, it doesn't have any advanced graphical settings menu. Unfortunately, I'm not able to show that to you right now because I don't have the footage, and I'll touch on that problem later in the video as well. However, it does increase the texture and the animation and overall graphical fidelity of the game to some extent, which is to be expected and definitely not surprising. Slight graphical design and the style of the game has been changed as well, which I think not necessarily for the worst. Obviously, given the fact that it is a visible deviation from the original, might upset some people. I personally have absolutely no problems with that. Now, audio is definitely overhauled and adjusted to meet the more modern array requirements, if you may. And to me personally, that sounded a little bit underwhelming at first. However, after having played several hours, I must say the game soundtrack does sound pretty good. The updated, modernized version of the tracks, and I believe all of the original tracks are still in the game. They do sound good, and it is almost bordering the levels of quality where I would listen to the soundtrack whilst not playing the game. However, there were, as I've mentioned earlier, a few things that were plaguing the original version and are still very much persistent and present in the definitive edition as well, which in my opinion may render the game's longevity somewhat shortened, if perhaps non-existent whatsoever. What I mean by that is, just like any RTS, when you're done playing single-player campaigns, when you're done practicing against the AI in random games or custom scenarios or and whatnot, by the game, the game does include a map editor with some tools for scripting and scenario making. They may not be too advanced, but essentially those tools are there for you to use, and really, I think you could still make pretty decent and interesting scenarios if you wanted to. But the main body of the game that makes it last for years and years, as we've seen with the example of StarCraft and now StarCraft 2, is the multiplayer. And I must say that there are some intrinsic flaws that were present in both the original game as well as definitive edition that very well may render this game pretty dead pretty quickly. Now, I would categorize it in two ways. The problems that I have with the game. And the first one is AI pathfinding, and the second is unit collision. To showcase the two issues I've had with AI pathfinding as well as unit collision, I've designed a couple of very simple tests that hopefully will provide some visual feedback of what I was talking about. So the first test is I essentially create a map with an independent little island, and I place some of the friendly and enemy units, and I just send them to fight it out. And we can see here we have two bands of cavalry fighting it out. And although things start relatively smoothly, we can see quickly that there are a lot of random and unnecessary movements of the cavalry units, both on friendly and the enemy line, which looks like it's being initiated by either friendly units bumping into friendly units or friendly units bumping into enemy units and not able to detect them and start attacking them. Where they trek relatively long distances, being completely disengaged from the battle, thus wasting precious time not fighting, even perhaps giving an unnecessary advantage to the enemy units. Now, to test for the AI pathfinding issues in the game, I've created a very small test island where I created a zigzag serpentine path of 2 tiles wide, stretching across this little island, and I place several units of cavalry at the bottom corner, and their goal is going to be pretty simple. I'm just going to send them to the top corner and see how they behave. Now, my first test is to select them and just click at the top corner of the island and let them choose the path themselves. Now, surprisingly, and this was quite surprising to me indeed, they actually lined up in very nice formation and just started going for that point without any collisions between themselves or starting glitching into the terrain. So it was a pretty nice and smooth journey until I started clicking on the point, whereas the cavalry units being furthest at the back were confused and had stopped in point, clearly starting recalculating with the closest route. Now when I clicked them to return back to the original location just once, they started walking backwards and they had no problems reaching that end destination. My second test was to place some enemy axemen, infantry units, in the way and see how my cavalry would react with some obstacles. At first I just sent them to the location, which means that they will ignore any attacks. However, very quickly they run into a little bottleneck as expected, because the path was only 2 tiles wide. What I do then, I send them on the attack move, which means they will attack any hostile enemies or structures on their original destination. Now what we can see clearly is that this one cavalryman is blocking the whole 2-tile pathway, and others, both on my side, my cavalry units are unable to pass and attack the enemies. However, the enemy units as well seem to be blocked out and unable or unwilling to attack. I'm pretty sure they were also within, my units were within enemy units line of sight, so therefore I don't see any real reason for the attacks not to take place. Now, when the fighting finishes, we can see that the cavalry units are taking absolutely ages to realize that the path is now clear, and they are really struggling to continue down to their final destination. The conclusion is pretty simple. Without going into too much statistical nitty-gritty detail, the fact of the matter is, as long as the path to their final destination is clear and not obscured, even if the enemies are around, as long as the units are able to find a clear path, their journey will be absolutely fine and swift. Those issues might be fine and okay to live with if we're talking about single-player only experience. However, my perspective is purely from multiplayer, and to be able to counter or negate these issues, you would have to employ some pretty crazy levels of micromanagement, which I don't think are neither feasible nor very practical, in the sense that time and effort could or should very well be placed in different aspects of the game, not ensuring that your units do what you want them to do. Now, if you remember earlier in the video, I did say I wanted to show you the settings menu and whatnot. However, I wasn't necessarily able to. This is exactly the reason. Essentially, every single time you launch the game, the Microsoft Store checks for your connectivity to Xbox Live Service. Essentially, this means that yes, you do have to be online and have an active Xbox account to play this game. Whether you're playing single player or multiplayer, that thing has to be present. In my opinion, this is the biggest downside and the biggest downfall of this game. That specifically being Microsoft Store, this online-only DRM integration, and the fact that a game that, even if you're not into multiplayer, you could get a very sufficient amounts of playtime single player only, both from the campaigns, simply play against the AI, or creating custom scenarios yourself with a map editor. These things are simply inaccessible if you don't have internet connection. And the reason I wasn't able to show you the settings menu and whatnot, because when I wanted to record that, for some reason the Xbox Live or the Microsoft Store online connectivity did not work. Overall, my verdict is yes, it's a clear improvement visually and both in audio perspective over the original. However, as hopefully I've made it clear from the gameplay perspective, the key points have not changed and the issues that were plaguing the original are still there. My final verdict would be, well, honestly, for a nostalgia trip, that would be quite an expensive one. There is absolutely no reason, therefore, for you not to consider spending that money on Age of Empires 2 HD Edition that is available on Steam. Not only that game is a couple of years newer, as in it was released in 1999 and re-released on Steam in HD Edition version 2013. It has way less overall gameplay issues that could very well plague your multiplayer experience. The game is playable on offline mode. It has ample single-player campaigns. Again, a very decent, actually much improved scenario editor. And overall, I would even say a better AI. So definitely give that a look. And only look into Age of Empires Definitive Edition if you are really looking to scratch that nostalgia itch. Otherwise, as far as it pains me to say, you should probably give this a miss or at least wait for a hefty discount. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you found it at least somewhat informative and useful in making your own decision whether to pick this game up now, perhaps wait for it, or just never look at it again. And if you did enjoy it, leave it a like, sub to the channel, and definitely leave your comments and observations down below. My name's been Integer, and pleasure as always speaking to you, and I'll see you in the next one.